Welcome back, everyone. This is video 8 of the Gull Guides featured highlight series, August 2025. Regardless of where you are in North America at the moment, you're very likely starting to see some juvenile gulls. And so this is definitely the time of year to recalibrate and reacquaint ourselves with these remarkable plumages. There's no question that what we're observing now is the freshest these birds will appear for the rest of the year and arguably for the rest of their lives. In this video, what I want to do is highlight some of the key features that we find in 3 of our most common large white-headed gulls, and that is ring-billed gull, California gull, and American herring gull. Now, these 3, being large white-headed gulls in the genus Laris, are wonderfully and wildly variable in plumage. And so it's very important to start this discussion with the need to consider size, structure, time of year, and of course, location. So in particular, what I want to do is focus strictly on juvenile plumages and not really get into the weeds of their post-juvenile molts and the variation and the wear and bleaching that we see later in the season. We'll save that for future videos. But here, when you look at this collage of ring-billed California and American herring gull, I hope you notice that all of their scapulars, meaning their back feathers, all of these scapulars are juvenile. These are no contrast feathers. They're uniform with the rest of the plumage. There hasn't been any systematic molt yet. Structurally, I hope you notice California gull, for example, has a proportionally small head, and it has this sort of long tubular bill that doesn't have a wide tip to it. Whereas in American herring, as you get towards this bill tip, you start to notice this graduated gonies angle. Okay, ring-billed tends to have a fairly thin bill as well, even thinner than California gull, and less of a gonies angle, smaller head. Ring-billed and California in particular are what we refer to as long-winged species. You can see this. They're proportionally long-winged. American herring, not so much, kind of a standard length, a nice compact look, as opposed to things like California and lesser blackback that have these long wing projections. Okay, so structurally that is what I'm looking for, and of course none of this can be appreciated if you don't have other species to make comparisons with. And so when I have a ring-billed and California together, it's quite obvious. California is larger, ring-billed is a little more petite in all of its parts. And when I have a California and herring, on average, herring looks bulkier, has this deeper chest, shorter wings, and larger head and bill. All right, so as for plumage, we'll get into juvenile first. This ring-billed in Illinois in August has what looks like a long wing projection. The bill is fairly petite, but overall, young ring-billed gulls don't have a very neat appearance to them. The underparts here are not solid, smooth brown. They're kind of blotchy and spotted and streaked. But one of the key features in young ring-billed gulls is the greater coverage track. You'll often notice this grayish wash, this silvery color. It's very subtle on this individual, but if you compare it to this bird from October, it's quite noticeable here. This greater coverage track usually has this contrasting gray, silvery look to it. Notice the upper tail coverts on this ring-billed gull. It's predominantly white with just some spotting or barring or chevrons. The pattern is variable, but the base color, notice, is white. By mid-season, before November, a lot of these ring-billed gulls will have a pink base to the bill with this sharply demarcated black tip. Again, I said I wasn't going to get into post-juvenile molts, but These are, just for comparison, what we refer to as first cycle. And we don't specifically call them juvenile anymore because they've now replaced systematically some feathers. It could be coverts, it could be tertials. Usually the first feather tracts to be replaced are these scapulars. And so these are first alternate birds, and you'll notice in the Gull Guide and other materials that they're not going to be referred to as juveniles, whereas this individual, where there is no systematic molt, and this individual are referred to strictly as juveniles. All right, California gull. This is in California, incidentally, August. Notice that long wing projection. Notice the tubular bill. And they tend to show fairly consistently this eye mask, where it's a contrasting dark patch around the eye. Lesser blackbacks also show that. One of the things I notice with California gulls is their lesser and median coverts tend to be very messy. There's no nicely arranged pattern to them. That's one thing I notice. This bird has quite a dark belly and breast compared to what you would see in a few months, where a lot of California gulls start to get paler in the belly and breast. Maybe a nicer example of this is this individual here. And then once you get to the vent region, it's quite remarkable. You have more white on the undertail coverts in the vent region. Small head, that's very noticeable in a good majority of them. And this straight, long tubular bill. For this date, October, by mid-October, I would say, late October, most of them have sharply bicolored bills. So this dark wash that you're seeing here on the culmen, that actually is not common once you get past October. It's more of all pale bill base, black tip. Dark eye mask, and it's not very obvious here, but this gate patch is something we often notice in more of older birds that have color here. So the color here makes it kind of difficult to see, but that gate patch is a nice feature of California gull. American herring, bulkier bill, shorter looking wings here. And one of the key features of this individual is the scapular pattern. We have what's called the holly leaf pattern. Now, this is not found in all American herrings, and it could be found in other species, but one of the things we often find in first cycle American herring gulls is this holly leaf pattern. The smooth brown wash, this velvety look to the breast and belly extends over to the neck and nape. The undertail coverts and vent region is not expected to be solid white. It's more predominated by brown pigments. Here's an individual from Newfoundland. The bill on this bird is probably still growing. This looks like a fairly short bill. I would guess it has some developing to do. But some features to take away. The first thing you'll notice here is the dark tail base. This is kind of a expected feature in Smithsonianus. So it's more important for people in Europe and Asia when they're looking for American herring gulls. A dark tail base like this would be something that would really excite them. For us, it's fairly standard, and that's what we expect from the majority of American herring gulls. Greater coverts have these dark bases. And again, notice the predominantly dark brown belly and underparts. It extends over into the vent region with less patterning than you would find in California gull and certainly in ring-billed gull. The scapulars on this bird are interesting. They're not so much holly leaf pattern. In fact, this pattern here with these short segments, these short centers on the scapulars, is not unlike some Thayer's gulls. So this is another feature where there's overlap across these Larus species, and the patterns are not standard and fixed or constant. The lesser and median coverts are kind of messy on this bird, but probably less so than California gull. Again, take into consideration the blockier head, the larger head, the deeper forehead, and the gape is fairly straight here. You don't have this down curved gape that you often notice in California gull. All right, flight feathers. We have on ring-billed gull, the inner primaries have this gray that kind of extends and is uniform with the greater coverts. And so in flight, you can readily see this. Greater coverts are silver gray, and the inner primaries have that silver gray. The tail pattern is variable in ring-billed gull. I'm going to show you a collage of different tails on first cycle ring-bills. This bird has a fairly white tail base, a fairly narrow tail band. As for the bill, this kind of is expected in July to have a mostly black bill, but by, August, September, late August, early September, you start to see a lot of pink on that bill base. Notice the gray greater coverts extending over to the inner primaries. A little more pigment on this bird's upper tail coverts. Now, you'll notice I'm not calling this a juvenile, and that's because the scapulars with the gray here are thought not to be juvenile. They're thought to be first alternate. So we call this a first cycle rather than a juvenile proper. All right, so here's this collage of young ring-billed gulls. Notice the variation in the tail patterns here. I think these are all July, August, I want to say. But thin tail band here, very narrow stripe across the tail tip. And then here we have this individual that has a fairly dark tail base. And so these are the extremes, really. Number 1 and number 9 are extreme tail patterns. I would say this middle row here is more common, more expected. All right, California gull in flight. This bird is interesting because it has fairly dark, solid brown belly and breast, even the nape and the head. But notice that shallow forehead, not very deep. And importantly, the inner primaries are typically dark. There's not a lot of contrast here. We say California gull lacks a window. Now, not all of them, but the great majority of them are not going to show this deep contrast between the inner primaries and the outer primaries. So here are my outer primaries in blue. There's not a lot of contrast there. Okay. On the undertail coverts, we expect a little more white going into the vent region, and the upper tail coverts also a good amount of white here, but more patterning that you would find, more consistent patterning that you would find in a ring-billed gull. Here's a California gull with an adult ring-billed in October. So with these primaries more spread like this, you can often see pale webs, inner webs. It's more obvious in some birds. There is some individual variation there. But one thing we often note with first cycle California gulls is what we call a dark double secondary bar. So there's this dark bar here across the greater coverts, and of course there's this dark bar across the secondaries. And so that is often visible in a majority of first cycle California gulls. What could happen is the inner greater coverts be barred and patterned, and so you're not really seeing the bases to these greater coverts because they're more covered by the median coverts. But it's still apparent here with the outer greater coverts and the secondaries. We have this double bar, and the tips to their greater coverts are more whitish. More patterning on this bird's upper tail coverts, and Fairly long into the season, I noticed these white tips to the tail feathers and white tips to the secondaries before that starts to wear down and break down with abrasion. The nape on this bird, fairly dark. The eye mask is fairly noticeable. Shallow forehead, very, very shallow forehead. And of course, the bicolored bill now is fairly standard. Notice we're calling this first cycle, and that is because the scapulars that we're seeing here, I hope you see that contrast. These scapulars are not uniform with the rest of the upper parts. Those are post-juvenile or first alternate scapulars. So first cycle here is more of an appropriate name than juvenile. American herring gull, November. This is kind of late in the season here for this bird to still have an all black bill and to show no molt in the scapulars. This is thought to be geographic, and so there's a lot of work that could be done with these American herring gulls, because in November, I don't typically expect Great Lakes American herring gulls and birds in the interior to still look like this. And so there's no telling where this bird comes from, but the assumption at the moment is either a very late hatch or a bird of more northern origins, but that kind of remains to be seen. Standard feature in first cycle American herrings is this dark tail base, right? And fairly dark upper tail coverts, densely patterned upper tail coverts. This bird, being so fresh and intact, interestingly, doesn't show a very contrasty inner primary window. This is fairly subdued and subtle. They're usually a lot more obvious than this. But also the greater coverts on American herrings, they're fairly plain. But I'm going to show you in the next photo one that's patterned. And so there's some variation here. And the more you look at these birds, especially at this time of year, before they start to get messier, the more you can appreciate these subtle differences in scapular patterns and greater coverts and the upper tail coverts. So these three regions that I have circled here, the greater coverts, the scapulars, and the upper tail coverts. I think if there was any takeaway from today's video is that sit with your local flocks of your most expected common species and take in those features on the greater coverts, the scapulars, and the upper tail coverts, and kind of appreciate that variation that could be found in just one species. All right, here's a first cycle American herring from British Columbia. The inner primary window is fairly standard. This is a more common look to the inner primaries of an American herring gull. The greater coverts still have fairly dark bases, predominantly dark greater coverts, but there's more patterning here along the tips. Notice on this bird also, it still has a fairly dark tail base and a good amount of patterning on the upper tail coverts, but this bird shows more white on the base color of the upper tail coverts, and it also shows not a solid dark tail base. This is what we sometimes refer to as ribbing or barring, and it's not uncommon at all to see this in American herring gulls. The bill now in November is fairly typical. They start to become bicolored, but this is a highly variable feature in first cycle American herring gulls. It is not diagnostic by any means. It could be bicolored in September. It could be all black into early third cycle. So the bill pattern is not a priority when you're identifying first cycle American herrings. Smooth brown underparts here, belly, breast, and even the wing linings. A fairly standard American herring here. The flight feathers on the outer primaries, secondaries, and tail feathers are dark. This bird has a pretty bulky bill, pretty deep forehead and large head, broad wing, not as long and narrow as, say, California gull. And again, that's something you're going to appreciate when you have them flying around together side by side. All right, I think this is going to be it for video 8. What I'd like to do is just, again, encourage you to get out there, get as close as you can to your flocks. And whether you're traveling somewhere on vacation or just traveling for birds, take note of what key features, at least, or average features you're seeing in these juveniles. There's, again, only a short window to see these juveniles before they start to molt and wear down. So, as always, if you have any suggestions or recommendations for future videos, just send those to me at the gullguide@gmail.com. Again, that's the gullguide@gmail.com. For those of you who've sent emails, your inquiries, your requests are in the queue. I promise to infuse those somehow in future videos. Thanks again for watching, everybody. Until next time.